The summer air hung heavy with expensive perfume and the scent of aged whiskey. Eduardo Vega stood at the edge of his marble balcony, looking out over the twinkling city lights below. At 45, he had everything money could buy. The cliffside mansion with its sweeping views, a collection of cars worth more than some small countries, and enough wealth to never work another day in his life. Yet as he sipped his drink, watching his guests mingle in his grand living room, he felt the familiar emptiness creeping in. Another successful evening, sir, said Richard, his chief of staff, appearing silently at his side. Eduardo nodded without enthusiasm. They're all the same, aren't they? Different faces, same conversations. 20 years ago, Eduardo had been a struggling programmer with big dreams. Now his tech security company protected the data of corporations and governments worldwide. The journey from nothing to everything should have felt satisfying. Instead, each party felt more hollow than the last. He drained his glass and turned back toward the noise. At least 100 people filled his home. Business partners, celebrities, politicians, and the ever-present circle of beautiful people who always seemed to find their way to wealth. Eduardo had stopped bothering to learn most of their names years ago. "Who's that?" Eduardo asked suddenly, pointing to a figure he hadn't noticed before. In the far corner of the room, a man in his 50s was quietly cleaning up a spilled drink. He wore the same black uniform as the other staff but moved with a different kind of care. Not the practiced efficiency of professional servers, but the thoughtful movements of someone who took pride in doing things properly. Richard followed his gaze. "That's the new caretaker, sir. Thomas Ellis. Started last week while you were in Singapore." "Caretaker? I thought we had a maintenance team." "We do, but after the storm damage last month, we needed someone full-time to handle repairs and general upkeep. Mr. Ellis came highly recommended. He lives in the groundskeeper's cottage now." Eduardo watched as Thomas finished cleaning and straightened up, wincing slightly as he stretched his back. There was something oddly dignified about him, a quiet presence that stood out amid the loud laughter and clinking glasses of the party. "He seems too, I don't know, refined for manual labor," Eduardo said. Richard shrugged. His references were excellent. Former estate manager for the Wellington family before they sold their property. He's good with his hands. Already fixed that persistent leak in the east wing that our regular plumbers couldn't solve. A burst of laughter pulled Eduardo's attention to the center of the room, where Olivia Chen, a famous actress, was telling a story to an adoring circle. Eduardo had dated her briefly last year, another relationship that had fizzled out when she realized his wealth couldn't cure his growing cynicism. "I need another drink," Eduardo muttered. As he moved through the crowd, Eduardo noticed the practiced way people responded to him, the immediate smiles, the eager greetings, the way conversations shifted to include him. It was all so predictable, so boring. By the time he reached the bar, Eduardo had decided he needed more than just another drink. He needed something to break the monotony. His eyes drifted to the grand piano that sat untouched in the alcove near the fireplace, a beautiful Steinway that had cost more than some houses. Eduardo had purchased it 3 years ago during a phase when he thought learning piano might fill some of the emptiness. Like many of his impulse purchases, it had quickly become just another piece of expensive furniture. A thought began to form in Eduardo's mind. It was childish, perhaps even cruel, but he was just drunk enough not to care. "Everyone," Eduardo called out, tapping a spoon against his crystal glass. The room gradually quieted as faces turned toward him. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you're enjoying yourselves." His guests responded with polite applause and raised glasses. "You know, I was just thinking," Eduardo continued, a mischievous smile playing at his lips, "how we're all so busy showing off what we have that we rarely show who we are." He gestured expansively. "Look around, we have CEOs, movie stars, artists. So much talent in one room." The crowd murmured appreciatively, though some looked wary, sensing Eduardo was up to something. But sometimes talent hides in unexpected places. Eduardo's eyes found Thomas, who was quietly arranging fresh flowers in a vase near the wall. "You there, caretaker?" The room fell quiet as Thomas looked up, surprised to be addressed. He straightened, his expression calm but cautious. "Yes, sir?" Thomas's voice was soft but clear, with a hint of an accent Eduardo couldn't quite place. Eduardo gestured for him to come forward. Thomas hesitated. then carefully set down the flowers and walked toward him. The crowd parted to let him through, some guests exchanging amused glances, sensing entertainment at the expense of the help. "What's your name again?" Eduardo asked, though Richard had just told him minutes ago. "Thomas Ellis, sir." Up close, Eduardo could see the lines of hard work etched on Thomas's face. His hands were strong and calloused, but his posture was straight, almost proud despite his humble position. "Thomas," Eduardo said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "do you play?" He gestured toward the piano. A strange expression flickered across Thomas's face, so brief Eduardo almost missed it. Was it pain, longing? Whatever it was quickly replaced by the polite mask of a servant. "I'm afraid I'm on duty, sir," Thomas answered diplomatically. "Oh, come now," Eduardo pressed, warming to his game. "I'm the boss and I say you can take a break." He turned to his guests with a theatrical wink. "Besides, we could use some entertainment." A few people chuckled. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes now fixed on the piano. "I haven't played in many years," he said quietly. "Perfect." Eduardo clapped his hands together. "Then we'll all be equally entertained by the attempt." He was being a jerk, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Eduardo knew it. But the alcohol in his system and the desperate need to feel something, anything, pushed him forward. With a flourish, Eduardo walked to the piano and lifted the lid, revealing the pristine keys. He gestured grandly for Thomas to sit. Thomas didn't move immediately. The room had gone completely silent now, everyone watching the uncomfortable scene unfold. Eduardo could feel Richard's disapproving gaze from across the room but ignored it. "Come on," Eduardo said, his voice taking on a challenging edge. "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you." He laughed loudly at his own joke, and after a moment of surprised silence, many guests joined in. Thomas took a deep breath and finally stepped forward. As he approached the piano, something subtle changed in his demeanor. His shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, and his eyes took on a focused quality. "Just one piece," Thomas said softly. Eduardo stepped back with an exaggerated bow, still smirking. "The stage is yours." Thomas sat down slowly, adjusting the bench with the care of someone who knew exactly how it should be positioned. He stared at the keys for a long moment, his worn hands hovering just above them. The party guests watched with varying expressions, some amused, some embarrassed, a few uncomfortable with the spectacle. In that suspended moment, Eduardo felt a flicker of doubt. There was something in the way Thomas looked at the piano, not with fear of embarrassment, but with the respect of someone greeting an old friend after a long absence. Thomas placed his fingers on the keys, closed his eyes briefly, and took a breath. No one in the room, least of all Eduardo, was prepared for what happened next. The first notes floated into the air like a question, delicate, hesitant, but perfectly formed. Then, as if a dam had broken, music began to pour from the piano in a torrent of sound that seemed impossible from those weathered hands. Eduardo's smirk froze on his face. His glass nearly slipped from his fingers as he watched the transformation happening before his eyes. This was no amateur fumbling at keys. This was artistry of the highest order. The caretaker's hands moved across the piano with the confidence and grace of a master. His whole body seemed to come alive with the music, swaying gently as the piece built from gentle melancholy to passionate intensity. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered. Everyone turned toward the unexpected performance unfolding in their midst. Eduardo couldn't tear his eyes away from Thomas's face. It was transformed. Years seemed to have fallen away, replaced by an expression of complete immersion in the music. There was pain there, yes, but also joy, longing, and a fierce kind of freedom. Eduardo had heard professional pianists play in concert halls around the world, but none had moved him like this. The music filled every corner of the room, somehow both technically brilliant and emotionally raw. It asked questions Eduardo had been avoiding for years. In that moment, as the caretaker played like his soul depended on it, Eduardo Vega felt something crack open inside him, something he'd carefully kept sealed away since trading his own dreams for the pursuit of wealth and power. The party, the mansion, the carefully constructed world of privilege he'd built around himself. Suddenly it all seemed paper-thin against the authenticity of what he was witnessing. The music ended, and for several heartbeats the room remained perfectly still, Then, like a wave breaking against the shore, applause erupted from every corner. Eduardo stood motionless, his forgotten drink still hanging in midair. What had just happened? The caretaker, this Thomas Ellis, had played with the skill and soul of a concert pianist. It made no sense. Thomas closed the piano lid gently, almost reverently. He stood and gave a slight bow, not the awkward nod of someone unused to applause, but the practiced acknowledgement of a performer. Then, without meeting Eduardo's stunned gaze, he turned and walked back toward the corner, where he'd been arranging flowers before being called over. The spell broke. Guests surged forward, surrounding Thomas with excited questions and praise. Eduardo watched as the man answered politely but briefly, his eyes darting toward the exit. He looked like he regretted his decision to play. "Who is he really?" Eduardo asked Richard, who had appeared at his side. Richard looked equally stunned. "I don't know, sir. His references checked out. Nothing in his file mentioned music. Find out," Eduardo said. Everything. The party continued, but its character had changed. The performance became the only topic of conversation, with guests debating whether Thomas was a former professional or some undiscovered genius. Eduardo barely participated, watching Thomas from across the room as the caretaker quietly returned to work, politely deflecting further questions. By midnight, most guests had departed, still buzzing about the unexpected entertainment. Eduardo found himself standing alone in his vast living room, staring at the piano. He walked over and lifted the lid, pressing a single key. The note hung in the air, somehow hollow compared to the music that had filled the room earlier. "Would you like me to close up the piano, sir?" Eduardo turned to find Thomas in the doorway, a cleaning cloth in hand. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was a wariness in his eyes. "You made me look like a fool tonight," Eduardo said. Thomas straightened. "That wasn't my intention, no?" Eduardo raised an eyebrow. "Then what was your intention when you decided to hide the fact that you're clearly a professional musician?" "You didn't hire me to play piano," Thomas said simply. "You hired me to maintain your property, which you're doing under false pretenses." A flash of something, anger perhaps, crossed Thomas's face before disappearing. "I didn't lie on my application. He didn't ask if I could play." Eduardo walked toward him, studying the man more carefully. Thomas was tall and lean, with graying hair at his temples. His posture was impeccable despite the physical nature of his work. Now that Eduardo was paying attention, he could see the telltale signs. The way Thomas's fingers moved unconsciously when music played through the speakers earlier. The careful way he held his hands. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," Eduardo said. "Not exactly amateur hour at the community center." A flicker of surprise crossed Thomas's face. "You know classical music?" "I know enough," Eduardo said. He'd grown up with a mother who taught piano. Though he'd never had the patience to master it himself, he'd absorbed more than he cared to admit. "Who are you really, Thomas Ellis?" Thomas looked down at his hands, strong, calloused, but with long, elegant fingers. Pianist's hands disguised by years of manual labor. "Just the caretaker, sir." "As I said, and before that?" "Many things." Thomas looked up, meeting Eduardo's gaze directly for the first time. "If my playing has caused problems, I apologize. It won't happen again." The quiet dignity in his voice made Eduardo feel ashamed of his earlier behavior. He'd put the man on the spot for his own entertainment, expecting embarrassment and getting brilliance instead. Now he was interrogating him like he'd committed a crime. "It wasn't a problem," Eduardo said, softer now. "It was extraordinary. I just don't understand why someone who can play like that would be working as a caretaker." Thomas was silent for so long that Eduardo thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he sighed. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Vega. Not all paths go where we think they will." There was a depth of experience in those simple words that made Eduardo suddenly aware of how little he knew about the lives of people who worked for him. How many other hidden talents and stories walked through his home every day, invisible to him because he never bothered to look. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Thomas asked, clearly hoping to end the conversation. Eduardo should have let him go. Instead, he found himself saying, "Play something else." Thomas frowned. "Sir, it's late and I still have work to—" "Please," Eduardo interrupted, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "Not for entertainment or to show off to guests, just, I'd like to hear more." Thomas studied him, seeming to weigh his sincerity. After a moment, he placed his cleaning cloth on a nearby table and walked to the piano. He sat down with that same subtle transformation Eduardo had noticed earlier, the caretaker becoming something else entirely. Any requests? Thomas asked, his fingers hovering over the keys. Whatever moved you to play the Chopin, Eduardo said. Play that. Thomas's hands descended, and this time the music that filled the room was different. Not the passionate complexity of the ballade, but something simpler, more intimate. Eduardo recognized it after a few measures. Debussy's Clair de Lune. Without an audience to perform for, Thomas played differently. His eyes closed, his body swayed gently, and his expression became so unguarded that Eduardo felt like he was witnessing something deeply personal. Eduardo lowered himself into a chair, transfixed. The music seemed to wash away the artificial gleam of the party, leaving behind something real and honest. It reminded him of sitting in his mother's small apartment as a child, listening to her play after a long day of teaching, the simple joy of beauty in an otherwise ordinary life. When the final notes faded away, Thomas opened his eyes. For a brief moment, Eduardo glimpsed raw emotion there before the caretaker's professional mask slid back into place. Thank you, Eduardo said quietly. Thomas nodded and stood. Good night, Mr. Vega. Wait, Eduardo called as Thomas reached the door. I made a ridiculous statement earlier, about marrying anyone who could play the piano. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. I didn't take it seriously, sir. Good, Eduardo said. But I am serious about wanting to understand how someone with your talent ended up here. Perhaps another time, Thomas said. It's not a short story and it's been a long day. After Thomas left, Eduardo remained seated for a long time, thinking. He'd built his life around accumulating things and experiences, treating people as either useful or entertaining. Tonight had shown him how shallow that perspective was. In the morning, Eduardo woke earlier than usual. His head throbbed from too much champagne, but his mind was surprisingly clear. He made his way to his home office and called for Richard. Did you find anything about Ellis? He asked when his chief of staff appeared. Richard handed him a tablet. It took some digging. He doesn't have much of an online presence. Eduardo scrolled through the information, his eyes widening. Thomas Ellison? The concert pianist? Apparently, Richard said. He was quite famous 20 years ago. Critics called him one of the most promising talents of his generation. Eduardo quickly searched the name and found old videos. There was no mistaking those hands, that posture. A younger Thomas sat at concert grands in prestigious venues around the world, playing with the same skill Eduardo had witnessed last night. What happened to him? Eduardo asked. Richard pointed to a news article from 15 years ago. Car accident. Damaged the nerves in his left hand. According to this, he canceled all future performances and disappeared from public life. Eduardo frowned, remembering Thomas's performance. His playing seemed perfect to me. I'm not an expert, Richard said, but from what I've read, he underwent years of physical therapy. He recovered much of his ability, but not enough for the perfectionist standards of classical performance. The critics were harsh when he attempted a comeback. Eduardo felt a pang of empathy. He knew something about harsh critics, about being judged and found wanting. The difference was that he'd abandoned his passions long before anyone could tell him he wasn't good enough. Where has he been all these years? Eduardo asked. Working various jobs, mostly estate management, groundskeeping. Always positions with private accommodations. Minimal public interaction. Hiding, Eduardo murmured. Eduardo spent the morning in his office, watching old performances of Thomas Ellison, and reading everything he could find about the man's career and sudden disappearance. The more he learned, the more questions he had. Around noon, he walked out to the gardens where he'd been told Thomas was working. He found the caretaker kneeling beside a flower bed, carefully removing weeds from around delicate blooms. Mr. Ellis, Eduardo called. Or should I say, Mr. Ellison? Thomas froze, his hand halfway through pulling a stubborn dandelion. For a moment, he didn't turn around. Then slowly he rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his hands. How did you find out? He asked quietly. Eduardo held up his phone. The internet remembers even when people try to forget. He scrolled through images of a younger Thomas in concert halls around the world. Thomas Ellison, child prodigy from a small town in Pennsylvania. Juilliard at 16. First international tour at 22. Acclaimed performances at Carnegie Hall, Royal Albert Hall, Sydney Opera House. Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral. That was another lifetime. 15 years ago isn't that long, Eduardo said, putting his phone away. Not long enough for someone to forget how to play like you did last night. A slight breeze ruffled Thomas's graying hair. He looked tired in the bright sunlight, the lines around his eyes deeper than Eduardo had noticed before. What do you want, Mr. Vega? The truth, Eduardo replied. Why is a world-class pianist pulling weeds in my garden? Thomas glanced toward the small cottage at the edge of the property, his current home. Perhaps we should sit down. This isn't a story I tell standing in a flower bed. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other at the simple wooden table in Thomas's cottage. The space was small but neat, with few personal belongings. A bookshelf held well-worn classics and music theory texts. No photographs, no mementos of his former life. Coffee? Thomas offered, pouring himself a cup. Eduardo nodded, watching as Thomas's left hand trembled slightly while handling the pot. It was barely noticeable, something you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The accident, Eduardo said, nodding toward Thomas's hand. Thomas set down the coffee pot and sat. Yes, rainy night, taxi driver fell asleep at the wheel. We hit a guardrail at 60 miles an hour. He flexed his fingers slowly. 3 surgeries and 2 years of physical therapy later, I could use my hand again. Just not the way I needed to. You seem to play perfectly well to me. A humorless smile touched Thomas's lips. That's because you're not a classical music critic or a competition judge or a conductor for a major symphony. To the untrained ear, yes, I recovered. But there's a hesitation in my left hand. Milliseconds of delay in certain complex passages. Occasional weakness in the 4th finger. He shrugged. In most professions, no one would notice or care. In concert piano, it's everything, Eduardo finished for him. I tried a comeback when I thought I was ready. Thomas stared into his coffee. The New York Times called it a tragic shadow of former brilliance. The London Review said I'd be better off retiring than subjecting audiences to the painful spectacle of diminished greatness. Eduardo winced. Critics can be brutal. They were right, Thomas said simply. That's what hurt the most. I could hear it too. The difference between what I could do before and what I could do after. My ear remained perfect while my hand became flawed. So you just quit? Disappeared? Thomas looked up, a flash of anger in his eyes. What would you have done? Music was my identity from the time I was 4 years old. I never had a backup plan. I never developed other skills. I practiced 8 hours a day while other kids played sports or went to parties or learned trades. The intensity in his voice faded as quickly as it had risen. When you lose the only thing you've ever been good at, the only thing people value you for, sometimes disappearing feels like the only option. Eduardo thought about his own path, how he'd abandoned his early passion for music to pursue technology and wealth. The difference was he'd made that choice. It hadn't been forced on him by circumstance, but why this? Eduardo gestured to the cottage, the gardening tools by the door. You could teach, couldn't you? Or compose? I tried teaching, Thomas admitted. But watching young talents develop what I had lost was, he shook his head. As for composing, the music in my head still requires the technical skill I no longer have. It was torture to write what I couldn't play. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. After a few dark years, I took a job as a house manager for a wealthy family in New England. Their estate needed constant attention, and the physical work, using my hands in a different way, felt healing somehow. When they moved to Europe, I found similar positions. I discovered I have a talent for fixing things, for making neglected spaces beautiful again. Like a form of restoration, Eduardo said thoughtfully. Thomas nodded. Exactly. And it comes with certain advantages. Privacy, independence, simple problems with clear solutions. He offered a small smile. Also, most employers don't ask their caretaker to perform Chopin at parties. Eduardo had the grace to look embarrassed. I was being an ass. You were, Thomas agreed mildly. I'm sorry. Thomas seemed surprised by the apology. Accepted. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing. Eduardo looked around the cottage again, noticing for the first time a small electronic keyboard tucked in the corner, headphones resting on top. Do you still play? For yourself, I mean. Thomas followed his gaze. Sometimes, when the silence gets too loud. He hesitated. Playing for your guests last night was the first time I've performed for an audience in almost 15 years. Why did you do it? Eduardo asked. You could have refused, played badly on purpose, anything to avoid revealing yourself. Thomas considered the question. Pride, maybe? Or perhaps I was tired of hiding. When you sit at a piano after years of training, muscle memory takes over. He flexed his fingers again. I suppose I wanted to know if I could still do it, even if not perfectly. It was perfect to everyone in that room, Eduardo said quietly. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. That's kind of you to say. Eduardo found himself smiling back, struck by the strange turn his life had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been a bored millionaire looking for entertainment at the expense of his staff. Now he was sitting in his caretaker's cottage, having the most honest conversation he'd experienced in years. I understand if you want to leave, Eduardo said. I've exposed your privacy, made things awkward. I can arrange a generous severance package, references for a new position. Thomas tilted his head, studying Eduardo with newfound curiosity. Is that what you want? For me to leave? The question caught Eduardo off guard. No, actually, no. He realized it was true. I think I'd like you to stay, if you're willing. Why? Thomas asked bluntly. It was Eduardo's turn to choose his words carefully. Because for the first time in longer than I care to admit, I'm interested in something. Someone. Not as a possession or entertainment, but as a person with a story I want to understand. The admission felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. Eduardo was used to transactional relationships, employees he paid, companions he impressed with his wealth, business partners he negotiated with. This felt different, risky. Thomas seemed to sense the shift too. He studied Eduardo for a long moment before speaking. I'll stay on one condition, he finally said. Name it. No more performances, no using me to impress your friends. I'm your caretaker, not your entertainment. Agreed, Eduardo said immediately. And no more ridiculous proposals, Thomas added with a hint of a smile, referencing Eduardo's drunken joke about marriage. Eduardo laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. Definitely not. Although technically that was part of the same condition. I'm being thorough, Thomas said dryly. As Eduardo walked back to the main house, he found himself wondering about the grand piano sitting unused in his living room. He'd bought it as a status symbol. Another expensive toy he quickly grew bored with. Now he imagined it differently, not as an ornament, but as an instrument meant to be played. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Richard, he said when his chief of staff answered, cancel my meetings for the rest of the week, and find me the best piano teacher in the city. Someone with patience for beginners, sir? Richard sounded confused. You want piano lessons? Yes, Eduardo said firmly. It's time I learned how to play for real. That evening, as the sun set over the cliffs, Eduardo sat alone at his piano. He placed his fingers on the keys, mimicking the position he'd seen Thomas use. He pressed down, producing a discordant jumble of notes that made him wince. From his window, he could see the light on in Thomas's cottage. The caretaker was out there, living a life so different from what he'd planned, finding meaning in the wake of loss. Eduardo looked back at the keys beneath his fingers. He had no illusions about becoming great or even good, but for once that wasn't the point. He wanted to understand, really understand, what it meant to create something beautiful instead of simply buying it. 3 weeks passed. Eduardo's fingers hurt constantly. His back ached from sitting straight on the piano bench. His teacher, Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman in her 70s with the patience of a saint and the demanding standards of a drill sergeant, showed no mercy for his wealth or status. Again, she would say, tapping her pencil on the music stand. And this time actually count the beats. Eduardo had forgotten what it felt like to be bad at something. Truly embarrassingly bad. He had avoided such situations most of his adult life, surrounding himself with activities where his money ensured success, or at least the appearance of it. But you couldn't buy your way out of learning piano. Your fingers either hit the right keys at the right time or they didn't, and Eduardo's usually didn't. You're thinking too much, Mrs. Chen told him during their 4th lesson. Piano isn't mathematics, it's language. Eduardo frowned at the simple piece he'd been struggling with for days. A language I apparently don't speak. Not yet, she agreed. But you will if you practice. 2 hours daily, as we discussed. After she left, Eduardo remained at the piano, stubbornly working through the piece again. And again, and again. His tech company had practically run itself lately, with Eduardo delegating more responsibility to his management team. For the first time in years, he found himself fully absorbed in learning something new, something challenging that couldn't be rushed or delegated. Eduardo hadn't seen much of Thomas in these weeks. The caretaker kept to his regular duties, maintaining a respectful distance. Occasionally, Eduardo would spot him working in the gardens or fixing something around the property. They would nod to each other, exchange brief pleasantries, but the deeper connection from their conversation in Thomas's cottage seemed to have retreated behind professional boundaries. Eduardo found himself oddly disappointed. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to value that brief moment of genuine interaction. One evening, after a particularly frustrating practice session, Eduardo walked out to his terrace with a glass of whiskey. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and pinks. From this vantage point, he could see Thomas's cottage. Light spilled from the windows, and faintly, Eduardo could hear music, not piano, but a recording of what sounded like a symphony. Acting on impulse, Eduardo set down his drink and headed toward the cottage. As he got closer, the music became clearer. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the second movement. Eduardo's mother had played this piece often. He knocked on the door, suddenly uncertain about this unannounced visit. The music lowered, and a moment later, Thomas opened the door. He was dressed casually in jeans and a faded sweater, looking younger somehow outside of his caretaker's uniform. Surprise registered on his face. "Mr. Vega," he said. "Is something wrong with the house?" "No, everything's fine," Eduardo said quickly. He hesitated, feeling foolish now. "I heard the music." "Beethoven's Seventh," Thomas nodded. "The Allegretto." "Would you like to come in?" The cottage looked different in the evening light, warmer, more lived in. Books lay open on the coffee table alongside a notepad filled with what looked like music notation. A half-empty cup of tea sat beside them. The small electronic keyboard was now set up properly on a stand, no longer tucked away in the corner. "I'm not interrupting?" Eduardo asked. Thomas shook his head. "Just spending time with an old friend." He gestured toward the speaker playing the symphony. "Can I get you anything? Tea, something stronger?" "No thanks." Eduardo's eyes drifted to the notepad. "You're composing?" Thomas followed his gaze and smiled slightly. "Attempting to. Nothing serious. Just ideas that keep me awake at night if I don't write them down." "I'd love to hear them sometime," Eduardo said, then quickly added, "If you wanted to share, of course." "No pressure," Thomas seemed to consider this. "Perhaps. They're very rough." He sat down and indicated for Eduardo to take the chair opposite. "Richard mentioned you've been taking piano lessons." Eduardo groaned dramatically. "Is the whole staff talking about what a terrible pianist I am?" "Not terrible," Thomas said with the hint of a smile. "Enthusiastic, I believe was the word." "That's generous," Eduardo laughed. "Mrs. Chen, my teacher, would use less flattering terms. I never realized how difficult it is. All those years of watching performers like you make it look so effortless." "That's the goal," Thomas said. "To make something incredibly complex appear simple and natural." Like good design, Eduardo nodded, thinking of his tech company's products. "But with music, your body has to execute the design, not just your mind." He looked down at his hands.
"And my body is not cooperating. How long have you been playing?"
3 weeks. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And you expected mastery already?" "Not mastery," Eduardo admitted. "But basic competence would be nice." "It takes time," Thomas said. "Even with natural talent, it takes thousands of hours of practice to develop true skill. I had played for 12 years before I performed at Carnegie Hall." 12 years? Eduardo looked horrified. "At this rate, I'll be ready for my debut when I'm 70. Thomas laughed, a genuine warm sound that Eduardo hadn't heard from him before. "Perhaps we need to adjust your expectations. That's what Mrs. Chen keeps saying." Eduardo hesitated, then asked, Would you be willing to listen to me play sometime?" "Not now," he added quickly. "God, definitely not now. But maybe when I've learned something that won't make your ears bleed." Thomas looked surprised by the request. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. I wouldn't want to overstep my role here." "It's not about your role," Eduardo said. He searched for the right words. "I respect your ear. Your understanding. Even if I'm never any good, I'd value your perspective." Thomas studied him, seeming to weigh the sincerity of the request against his own reservations. "All right," he finally said. "When you're ready." They talked for another hour, about music at first, then about books, travel, and eventually Eduardo's company. Eduardo found himself explaining complex tech security concepts, surprised by Thomas's quick understanding and insightful questions. "You know," Eduardo said as the conversation naturally wound down, "you're wasted as a caretaker. With your mind you could do anything." Thomas's expression closed slightly. "I'm good at what I do. There's value in that." "Of course there is," Eduardo said quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just meant—" He paused, realizing he was about to step onto dangerous ground. "Never mind. It's not my place." "No, please," Thomas said. "Finish your thought." Eduardo chose his next words carefully. "I only meant that you seem to have multiple talents. Your music, obviously, but also your intelligence, your insight. I wonder sometimes if you're hiding here because it's easier than facing the world that hurt you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "That's quite an observation from someone who's known me less than a month." "I'm sorry," Eduardo said. "That was presumptuous." "Yes," Thomas agreed, "but not entirely wrong." A cricket chirped outside, filling the silence between them. "After my accident," Thomas finally continued, "I lost more than just technical ability. I lost my place in the world, my community, my identity." He looked around the small cottage. This kind of life, private, separate, became comfortable, safe. "And now?" Eduardo asked. "Is it still just about safety?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Now it's habit, I suppose. Patterns are hard to break once they're established." He glanced at the keyboard, then back to Eduardo. "But playing at your party, it woke something up. Something I thought was gone. Is that why you've set up the keyboard?" Eduardo gestured to the instrument, no longer hidden away. Thomas nodded. "I've been playing more, just for myself." "I'm glad," Eduardo said softly. As he walked back to the main house later, Eduardo reflected on how strange life could be. A month ago, he had been sleepwalking through existence, surrounded by wealth but empty of purpose. Now he found himself looking forward to each day, to his clumsy attempts at piano, to the brief glimpses of Thomas working around the property, to the possibility of more conversations like the one they'd just had. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt like he was waking up, and it had taken someone who had lost everything to show him how much he'd been missing. Autumn arrived, painting the cliffside property in brilliant oranges and reds. 3 months had passed since the night of the party that had changed everything. Eduardo sat at his piano, working through a simple Chopin prelude that would have seemed impossible to him 12 weeks ago. His fingers moved more confidently now, though still far from the fluid grace of an accomplished pianist. "Better," said a voice from the doorway. Eduardo looked up to see Thomas leaning against the frame, a half smile on his face. Their relationship had evolved in subtle ways over these months. Thomas was still the caretaker, still maintained the property with quiet efficiency, but the rigid formality between them had softened. Once a week, Eduardo would play whatever piece he was learning, and Thomas would offer gentle guidance. "Only better?" Eduardo asked, feigning offense. "Much better," Thomas clarified, walking into the room. "Your left hand is finally working independently from your right, and you're not looking at the keys as often." Eduardo nodded, pleased with the assessment. He had discovered an unexpected joy in these small victories, these incremental improvements that came only through persistent effort. It was so different from the instant gratification of wealth, the ability to simply buy whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. "I have something to show you," Thomas said. He seemed unusually nervous, shifting his weight slightly from one foot to the other. "If you're interested." "Of course," Eduardo said, closing the piano lid and standing. "It's at the cottage. Would you mind coming down?" 10 minutes later, Eduardo sat in the small living room of Thomas's cottage, while the caretaker retrieved something from the bedroom. The space had changed subtly over the months. More books filled the shelves. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the table. Sheet music was neatly stacked beside the keyboard, which now occupied a place of prominence rather than being tucked away. Thomas returned with a manila folder. "I've been working on this," he said, handing it to Eduardo. "It's still rough, but—" Eduardo opened the folder to find handwritten sheet music, the notes carefully drawn on the staff paper. At the top of the first page was a title, "Restoration in G minor." "You composed this?" Eduardo asked, scanning the notes. His ability to read music was still rudimentary, but he could tell this was a complex piece. Thomas nodded, watching Eduardo's reaction carefully. I've been working on it since the night I played at your party. It started as fragments, ideas that wouldn't leave me alone. Eventually, they began to form a coherent whole. Can I hear it? Eduardo asked. Thomas hesitated. It's meant for a full piano, not my keyboard, and he paused. I'm not sure I'm ready to perform it yet. Not fully. Would you consider recording it? Eduardo asked. When you're ready, of course. My piano is yours anytime you want to use it. A complicated expression crossed Thomas's face, something between longing and fear. Perhaps someday. Eduardo handed the folder back. What does the title mean? Restoration in G minor? Thomas took a deep breath. It's about rebuilding after loss, finding new purpose when the old one is gone. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. It sounds pretentious when I say it aloud. Not at all, Eduardo said. It sounds honest. That evening, after returning to the main house, Eduardo sat in his study thinking about Thomas's composition, about the courage it must have taken for the former concert pianist to create music again. After so much pain and disappointment, Eduardo looked around at the evidence of his own life, the awards for business innovation, the photographs with celebrities and politicians, the expensive art chosen by professional decorators. It all suddenly seemed hollow, built on the foundation of his wealth rather than any real passion or purpose. He picked up his phone and called Richard. I need you to set up a meeting, Eduardo said when his chief of staff answered. With the director of the Henderson Music Academy. The children's music school downtown? Richard asked, sounding confused. That's the one, Eduardo confirmed. I have an idea I want to discuss with them. 2 weeks later, Eduardo invited Thomas to dinner at the main house. This wasn't unusual anymore. They had shared meals several times over the past months, their conversations ranging from music to books to philosophy. But tonight was different. Eduardo had something specific in mind. They ate on the terrace overlooking the ocean, the autumn air crisp but not yet cold enough to drive them inside. Thomas had become more comfortable in these settings, no longer the hesitant caretaker afraid to say the wrong thing. I've been thinking, Eduardo said as they finished their meal, about purpose, about what we do with our lives. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That's quite a topic for a Tuesday evening. Eduardo smiled. I suppose it is. He took a sip of his wine before continuing. You know, when I started learning piano, it wasn't really about the music. Not at first. It was about understanding what had been taken from you. Thomas's expression grew more serious. And now? Now it's about understanding what I've taken from myself, Eduardo said. All these years pursuing wealth and status, I lost touch with what actually matters. With creating something meaningful rather than just consuming what others create. Thomas nodded slowly. That's a valuable realization. I've made a decision, Eduardo continued. 2, actually. The first is that I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations at my company. I'll remain on the board, but I'm turning over the CEO position to my COO, who frankly has been running things anyway while I've been distracted with parties and possessions. That's a big change, Thomas observed. Are you sure? More sure than I've been about anything in a long time, Eduardo said. The second decision involves you if you're willing. Thomas looked wary. Me? Eduardo pulled a folder from beside his chair and placed it on the table. The Henderson Music Academy provides music education to children who couldn't otherwise afford it. Good kids, real talent, no resources. I've established a foundation to support them, expand their programs, provide instruments and instruction. Thomas looked at the folder but didn't open it. That's commendable. They need a creative director, Eduardo continued. Someone who understands music education, who can design programs, mentor students, maybe even teach the especially gifted ones. He met Thomas's eyes directly. I recommended you. Thomas went very still. Eduardo? Before you say no, Eduardo said quickly, just know that this isn't charity. It's not even really about you. It's about those kids who deserve someone with your knowledge and experience, someone who understands both greatness and loss. I haven't taught in 15 years, Thomas said softly. I'm not sure I even remember how. Some things you don't forget, Eduardo replied. Like playing Chopin after 15 years away from an audience. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening ocean. "I'd have to leave here," he finally said. "Find a place in the city." "Actually," Eduardo said, "that's the third thing I wanted to discuss. I've decided to donate this property to the foundation as well. It can serve as a retreat, a place for special programs, master classes." He looked around at the sprawling grounds. "It's too big for one person anyway. Always has been. Where will you live?" Thomas asked, surprised. "I bought a smaller place downtown, still embarrassingly luxurious but closer to normal human scale." Eduardo smiled. "And closer to Henderson, where I'll be volunteering as a very mediocre piano teacher for beginners." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "You're serious about this?" "Completely serious," Eduardo confirmed. "Though, of course, if you don't want the position, there's no obligation. The donation to Henderson stands either way." "And if I do want it?" Thomas asked, a new light in his eyes that Eduardo hadn't seen before. "Then you'd be doing those kids an incredible service," Eduardo said. "And selfishly, I'd get to hear your composition played on a proper piano someday." A smile slowly spread across Thomas's face. Not the cautious, reserved smile Eduardo had grown accustomed to, but something open and genuine. "I'd need to think about it. Talk to the school director. Understand the expectations." "Of course," Eduardo said. "Take all the time you need." Later that night, after Thomas had returned to his cottage with the Henderson folder, Eduardo stood at the window looking out at the property that had been his pride for so long. Soon it would belong to the foundation, filled with young musicians and dedicated teachers. The thought gave him more satisfaction than he'd expected. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Thomas. "Yes, and thank you." Eduardo smiled. When he had jokingly offered to marry anyone who could play his piano all those months ago, he could never have imagined where it would lead. Not to marriage, but to something equally transformative, a friendship that had changed them both, restored them both in ways neither could have predicted. He sent back a simple reply. "The pleasure is mine. See you tomorrow, Professor Ellison." Then Eduardo sat down at his piano one last time in this house. His fingers found the keys of the simple piece he'd been practicing, not with the brilliance of Thomas Ellison, but with the joy of someone who had discovered that it's never too late to start again.